Thanks, Jay. Thanks, Dean Rutherford. What a pleasure to be in this magnificent complex. It's a tribute to both Little Rock and to President Clinton. I was thinking about President Clinton's years in office, and he had to deal with some of the same big trends that I'm going to speak about today in international trade and international finance. And he also had to deal with America's racial conundrum, which origins were in both the American North and the American South. My book began in 1962 when I entered Yale University as a freshman. I was the only person in my class of 1,000 from Mississippi, and that was the same year that James Meredith integrated the University of Mississippi. The attendant violence and national publicity made everybody quite annoyed with me, and I was besieged with questions. Thereupon began a long study of economic history, Southern history, and racial history. Why cotton? Cotton was the single most important determinant of the 19th century because it prolonged slavery, and slave-produced cotton caused the Civil War, and we live with its legacies today. Cotton also spawned two revolutions, the Industrial Revolution and as I said before, the American Civil War. It was a young Karl Marx who remarked that without cotton you have no modern industry. Without slavery you have no cotton. And who was Marx's financial backer? It was Frederick Ingalls. And where did the Ingalls money come from? It came from his family textile mill in Manchester, England. The story starts in 1787, which at the Constitutional Convention, which enshrined slavery in the Constitution. There was no cotton of any amount grown in the country at this point. The nation faced a very ugly choice: a nation with slavery or no nation without slavery. And we know what that choice was. The choice was brokered by two trading states, South Carolina and Connecticut. And in the words of Oliver Ellsworth, the Connecticut representative, slavery will not be a speck on the horizon. So they rationalized and said slavery was going to die anyway, so let's have a country. What I want to introduce now is a different question, and we'll start at the beginning. It is what did people, not only what people thought about slavery, but what they thought about black people, because this will be the key to understanding what happened after emancipation until the present. Take Benjamin Franklin, anti-slavery at the Constitutional Convention. But in 1789, he wrote that free blacks should be supervised by a national police force, and they should be trained for those jobs which required little skill. Now, what happened to this prophecy of extinction of slavery? It was blindsided, and there were two factors that entered into this. One, of course, was the technological revolution in the English textile mills in the late 18th and early 19th century. Bottom line, here's what happened. The price of a textile garment dropped by 99% between 1787 and the beginning of the Civil War. This, of course, created a consumer revolution. At the beginning of this period, 3/4 of the clothes worn by Europeans was wool. At the end of this period, 3/4 was cotton. And where did this cotton come from? 90% of it came from one place, the American South. So there was this insatiable appetite for cotton. The second factor, of course, was Eli Whitney's cotton gin. There he was, oldest graduate of Yale College in 1792, couldn't get a job, went south as a tutor on a Georgia plantation, and within a couple weeks had created a gadget which would separate the lint from the seed. There's no indication that Eli Whitney cared one way or the other about slavery. But what happened was one person could clean 50 pounds of cotton rather than 1 pound per day. And the implications were staggering. From no cotton at the beginning of the period to 4.5 million bales at the end of the period, 500-pound bales. And over here you see an 1850s photograph of the New Orleans harbor. And it looks like something that you would think about in terms of Hong Kong or Shanghai today. This was the dynamism of that world. in terms of slavery, that population increased from 700,000 to 4 million. 70% of those people were directly or indirectly involved with cotton production. So when there's this historical argument about what caused the Civil War, slavery or states' rights, when you say slavery, you have to ask, what did those people do? And they were largely in the gold rush, which was cotton production at that point in time. The price of a slave directly correlated with the price of cotton. Slavery only spread where you could grow cotton. At 4 cents a pound, slavery withered. At 10 to 11 cents a pound, it expanded. At $1.90 a pound during the Civil War, the entire Western Corps of Union officers was corrupted in terms of smuggling. At 40 cents a pound, at the end of the Civil War, hordes of white Northerners came down to the South to farm cotton. Now, a slave was so valuable that he could not be used in many dangerous works. So who were the expendable class? The Irish. They were the people who were made to work on the levees and the malarial areas. So if an Irish person died, you threw him in a ditch. If a slave died, you had to compensate the owner. The largest producer on the eve of the Civil War was Mississippi, which only existed with a handful of Europeans at the beginning of the period. At the end of this period, there were 800,000 people in Mississippi, 450,000 slaves, 350,000 white people. The production was 1,250,000 bales. The Mississippi Secession Convention voted 84 to 15 to secede from the Union. It voted 66 to 13 to prohibit the international slave trade because it didn't want an influx of people to drive down the price of slaves. Always it should be remembered that slavery had to have some form of economic base. In short, no one would have taken the South seriously without cotton. The South would not have taken itself seriously without cotton. Was cotton a regional phenomenon? Absolutely not. It knitted the country together. Foodstuffs came in from the West into the South. It propelled growth out there. New York City, 40% of all cotton revenues before the Civil War ended up in New York City. It was called the capital of the South. Now, in terms of overall numbers, 60% of all exports, and we know about exports today, 60% of all American exports before the Civil War were cotton. Cotton was the leading export in this country, and it will never be equaled. From 1803 to 1937, and we don't think of this as a significant crop now or industry, but it certainly was then, and it dragged an entire people with it, 60 years as slaves and 100 years thereafter as free laborers. When we think of the slave market, we think of New Orleans, but what was the largest center for slave trading internationally? It was New York City. Financed and fitted out ships that were sent from New York City to the west coast of Africa, where human beings were purchased and sold not in America but in Cuba and Brazil. When an anti-slavery advocate got up before the Trinity Church, the fourth largest still real estate owner in New York City, he wanted to pass a resolution that would that prohibit the slave trade, and he was voted down 54 to 6. The third leg of this, of course, was Great Britain. Great Britain was the most powerful nation in the world at this point. 22 million people. 4 to 5 million of those people were directly or indirectly involved with cotton textiles, and they were located in one particular area, Lancashire. 90% of their cotton came from the American South. So they were enormously vulnerable to the South at this point in time. What does this sound like? If it sounds like oil today, you're absolutely right. The power of cotton in the 19th century was equal to the power of oil today. Now, history is not just a narrative, it's a puzzle. So we're going to look at one aspect of this, and that is race in the North. Connecticut, let's take Connecticut. 1784, gradual emancipation bill passed. 1800, there was a survey that was issued in Connecticut to the towns. And the question, Article 27, asked the following. Was a black person born free different from those who were born enslaved in terms of morality and in terms of industry? And the results came back and they were devastating. Timothy Dwight, the president of Yale in 1810, said these people are neither able nor inclined to make freedom a blessing. For blacks, the hatred of labor becomes a habit. They are therefore left as miserable victims of sloth, poverty, and ignorance. What did this mean? Within 2 years, Connecticut had disenfranchised its black population. Do you know how large that population was? Under 2%. Connecticut in 1860, by an 80% majority, voted yet again. This time the percentage was 1.5% to maintain the prohibition on black suffrage. Connecticut voted against the 15th Amendment. It also, within a couple of years, started the Colonization Society to rid itself of its black population. The person who's most identified in terms of Connecticut and the Civil War, of course, is Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. She knew what cotton was about. In Uncle Tom's Cabin, she said, if something would make the price of cotton fall permanently, slavery would become a burden on that market. We know what you thought about slavery. What did you think about black people? What happened to the heroes and heroines of Uncle Tom's Cabin? She sent them to Africa. Frederick Douglass, the great black leader, said, Madam, we are here and we are here to stay. In 1854, Douglass asked Harriet Beecher Stowe to contribute to a school for blacks in Washington, D.C. She refused. In her correspondence later, it came out, when will they ever learn to walk? How many of you knew that Harriet Beecher Stowe was a cotton farmer? After the Civil War, she financed her son's cotton farm in Florida, and it went bust in a year, and she moved back to New England. Let's go west. It gets worse in the west. Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, exclusion laws. Blacks couldn't serve on juries or in the militia. 1813, Illinois. If a free black or mulatto does not leave the state within 2 weeks, 39 lashes will be applied. 1862 in Illinois voted to maintain prohibition on black suffrage. Do you know how many black people lived in Illinois in 1862? 0.5% of the population. So if anyone thinks that there was racial tolerance that was spawned in the Civil War, think again. Oregon, with 100 black people, had an exclusion law in its constitution in 1857. So back to cotton. What was the South's strategy during the Civil War? It was to starve England of its cotton, therefore creating mass unemployment and social unrest. Was this a Southern strategy first? Absolutely not. It originated in 1839 with Nicholas Biddle, the powerful president of the Bank of the U.S., who tried to manipulate the cotton market, and he went broke in the process. So look at the two leading opponents of the 1830s, Andrew Jackson and Nicholas Biddle. Andrew Jackson, president, was a cotton farmer. Nicholas Biddle was a cotton trader. Jefferson Davis, in February 1861, stood on the steps of the Confederate Capitol and said, if the North dare interfere with our cotton trade, we will retaliate. The South, in effect, pointed a gun at England. Well, what happened? Why didn't this strategy work? It didn't work because England had an inventory of 1,200,000 bales of cotton. So the cotton famine, as it was called, did not start until 1862. At that point in time, the Confederate advances at Antietam had been stopped, so England basically waited. But cotton was very significant in the Civil War for two reasons. Number one, it was used as barter for arms, and we heard about the blockade being very efficient. The blockade wasn't efficient. Wilmington, North Carolina, guns and ammunition were pouring in even by January 1865. The land forces that captured the southern ports were effective. But take, for example, in 1862, the Fingal, a ship, a blockade runner, took armaments from England, brought them to Savannah, where they were shipped by rail to Shiloh and outfitted the Confederate Army. The Florida, the Alabama, the Shenandoah, ships built in England, manned by English crews, destroyed the entire northern merchant marine. How many of you knew that England had to pay reparations for that damage to the American North after the Civil War? England and the U.S. almost went to war during this. But cotton, as we know, like oil, can become very powerful. By 1863, the South had finally realized that what they should have done was to ship cotton over to Europe and borrow against it. This is the famous cotton bond, the Erlanger bond, and it's the forerunner of all modern finance, in my opinion. It's a securitized loan. It's convertible in two currencies, pound sterling, French francs, and it's convertible into cotton. The South would have been a much more efficient fighting machine had this happened. So if this was such a moral war, who were the North's international allies? None, absolutely none. Britain armed the South and wanted the U.S. to be dismembered. They were afraid that the American North was going to take over Canada if, in fact, they allied with the South. Canada, the refuge of the fugitive slaves, whose side were they on? They cut off all aid to the fugitive slaves when the Civil War started. There was an exclusion law in Canada by the end of the 19th century. The Battle of Bull Run, won by the Confederates, was cheered in the Canadian Parliament. Halifax, Nova Scotia was a fueling stop for blockade runners. During this period, as I mentioned earlier, the price of cotton went to $1.90, and every Union officer was involved on the West in terms of smuggling. And Lincoln didn't care. He said as long as the cotton didn't get to England, he never saw much good come out of pecuniary greed. In terms of race, let's look what happened. 1863, July, draft riots in New York. Black people murdered in the streets. The, quote, colored orphanage was burned. There's no memorialization of that in New York. Troops from Gettysburg were pulled to go to quell that riot. Now, in terms of what happened and that led to what I call the containment policy. As we know, slaves ended up behind Union lines. These were called contraband, and they were a big problem for the Union Army. The first attempt to deal with them is General John Dix in Virginia, and he tried to send thousands of them to Boston and to Massachusetts. The hero of the movie Glory, John Andrews, said, no, we don't want them. This is 1862. They'll end up as paupers. 2 years later, in 1864, Governor Andrew wrote Lincoln and said, please send them to us. Lincoln, in a sarcastic manner, was furious. He knew exactly what was going on. Andrew wanted those people sent there so they could be used to fill draft quotas and sent back into the war. Essentially, the same thing happened on the Western Front, where contraband were shipped north to Illinois in trains, and race riots broke out. That was again September 1862. The policy was disbanded after 30 days. The freed slaves were put to work on abandoned plantations, primarily near Vicksburg, Mississippi, where they were cheated with reckless abandon by white northern lessees. Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863, one of the triumphs of American history. What bill did Lincoln sign the day before? He signed an appropriation bill of several $100,000 to encourage colonization. And again, we're back to this area of what happened after the Civil War. These anti-slavery people, and what were their thoughts? William Seward. No one was more anti-slavery than William Seward. Governor of New York, senator from New York, Lincoln's right hand. 1866, after the Civil War, he said, "The North cares nothing for Negroes. They're no more than Hottentots. They are God's poor. They will be everywhere." Edward Atkinson supplied guns to John Brown in Kansas. But his attitude was, we must admit that we must have cotton and that the emancipated slaves will be idle and utterly useless unless they work in the cotton fields. If he does not work, let him starve and exterminate himself if he will, and so remove the Negro question. Still, we must raise cotton. The New York Times, February 1865, we must get cotton back into production. That means two things. One, black labor and white ingenuity. And the article in the New York Times goes further and said, the black person must live side by side with a white person for centuries to be constantly improved, a few elevated to the level of equality. So what did this mean after the Civil War? And if those of you who saw the movie The Help, and the question that was posed to Aibileen, the maid, why were our only two choices in life to be a cotton laborer or a maid? And here we come to what I called before the containment policy. Between 1865 and World War I, there was no black migration north. If you ask an advanced placement course of 11th graders what would have happened if the North had been racially tolerant, they would have said, they did say, everyone would have moved north. During this period, almost 20 million white immigrants came into the North. So the black population of the North stayed under 2% until World War I, and yet another economic force intervened. What was that force? It was World War I. So three things happen in a war. Unemployment goes from 8.5% to 1.5%. Industry booms, and no white immigration. So this was the impetus behind what? The black migration north. And race riots ensued very quickly thereafter. The big one in Chicago, July of 1919. This is an illustration from Harper's, and it's the one attempt at mass migration before the Great Migration. And these people are getting on boats to go up the Mississippi River to Kansas, so the so-called Exodus movement. Now Kansas, as you remember, was the battleground slave of Free State. This is what happened in 1878, 1879. As those people went north, Kansas says, no, I don't want them. That's the only attempt of mass migration before World War I. Now, cotton enters into the educational field as well. And think of the great wealth in this country wasn't made on the cotton farms. It was made by the industrialists, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Rosenwald. And what was their number one priority? Their number one priority, turn of the century and beginning of the 20th century, was black education. And what did they mean by black education? When Andrew Carnegie gave the seed money for the largest, huge donation, $600,000 in 1903 to Tuskegee Institute, he said the following: we cannot produce enough cotton for the wants of the world. It is certain that we need more cotton to meet the demands of this indispensable product. We therefore need to train the black person. So everything feeds back in terms of this containment of black people, and the linkage with cotton remains intact. The destiny of cotton, of black people in this country, was linked absolutely to cotton. 90% of all black people lived in the South on the eve of World War I. 50% of those people were involved with cotton production. And what about cotton production? Within a few years after the Civil War, cotton production was greater than it was before the Civil War. cotton had maintained its 75% majority of exports in the world. So what transpired in this environment? The North could have done anything it wanted to the South. The South was utterly defeated after the Civil War. The first thing it did was take the number of troops, 1 million men in arms, May of 1865, down to 200,000 a few months later, down to a few thousand within a few years. There was no indication that the North, and Grant in 1875 pulled the final plug when he didn't send troops to Vicksburg. When the able black congressman from Mississippi, John Roy Lynch, confronted Grant, Grant said it was political. I would lose, if I sent troops to Mississippi, I would lose Ohio. That was the expediency involved. Even black rights that were given in the North were such that many of the radical Republicans interpreted that as keeping black people in the South for Republican majorities, et cetera. So what about this cotton business? If a cotton farmer after the Civil War went into a banker and said, I want to borrow some money, the banker would look at him and say, what kind of business are you in? And the cotton farmer said, well, I don't know how much cotton I'm going to plant. I don't know what the weather is going to be like. I don't know what the insect situation is going to be like. I don't know what my production is going to be like. And I have no idea what the price is going to be like. Oh, and by the way, I only get paid once a year. The banker is going to throw up his arms and said, I want the first lien on your production. There, again, is the economic driving force for the sharecropper system. It was the only way to finance it, and black people initiated the sharecropper system after the Civil War. What happened was, as we know, African Americans had no legal recourse, so they could be cheated with impunity, which they were on these cotton firms. The other thing that we need to bear in mind was technology. The cotton gin labor-saving device created a labor shortage. There were 750 patents for the cotton gin between the end of the Civil War and the 1930s, when the successful ones began to be tried. It was the most difficult thing imaginable to do. But regardless of that, cotton production increased to 17 million bales in the 1920s. And there again, the book ends in the 1930s because during the Depression, cotton became a permanent ward of the federal government. But you had this cosmopolitan, international, global, the first sophisticated global business that was layered on an oppressed labor force. And as an example of this man is Will Clayton, and you see he's on the cover of Time magazine in 1936. It's the last time you'll ever see somebody in the cotton business on the cover of Time magazine. He was the principal partner in Anderson Clayton, the cotton brokerage firm that was based in Houston. The important thing to remember about him is that he was Undersecretary of Economics in the Truman administration, and he was the first guy to negotiate a loan with Great Britain after the World War II. And he negotiated it with John Maynard Keynes. But it was his blueprint. It was his blueprint that was actually copied by George Marshall that became the Marshall Plan. So the Marshall Plan, in many ways, is derivative of the cotton world. In terms of the African American population, the book stops in the 1930s because legal segregation was enshrined in the system at that point. It was just on the cusp of Charles Hamilton Houston's brilliant and clever assault on legal segregation in the education area. And to show you what America was like, this is going to be shocking. This is going to be a Business Week cover in 1930 to show you exactly what America was like in the 1930s. And you can see this extraordinary offensive, or this was on the cover of a national magazine. So we move to the present date, a quick timeline, so we can have a chance for questions. Cotton became a product of technology. A 10,000-acre cotton farm in the Mississippi Delta in the 1930s would have 1,000 families. This is Delta and Pound land, which meant 4,000 to 5,000 people on that land. Today, that land can be farmed by 5 people. And America is not the largest cotton producer anymore. China is because of its need in the textile industry. There are 25 million cotton farmers in China today, and they're on 2 to 3 acre plots. And they cannot be mechanized because what happens during mechanization, people are displaced. China cannot have millions of people move into the cities. This is the same phenomena that occurred in the 1960s when race finally became decoupled from cotton, and there was this massive dislocation of cotton workers. In terms of where we are today in terms of race, if you do a timeline between Plessy, Ferguson, Brown versus Topeka, everybody knows what happened in terms of the South, whether it be Little Rock, Jackson, Mississippi, Birmingham, Selma, Montgomery, Greensboro, during the 60s. Simultaneously, not sequentially, very few of us know what was going on in the North at this point in time. So from the North, we moved in the South. From the back of the bus to the North, forced busing. Desegregation suits start popping up all over the place. 1962, the NAACP initiated 21 suits. Included in those cities were New York, Rochester, San Francisco, and other places. Race riots, as we know. The big ones, Watts, Newark, and Detroit. The Moynihan Report, the disintegration of the black family, and the Kerner Report, which indicated that we are moving towards 2 separate nations, one black, one white, one both unequal. He was wrong. The Kerner Commission was wrong. That separate, unequal society had started 200 years before and was cast. In 1969, Senator Abraham Ribicoff, who was formerly governor of Connecticut, John Kennedy's favorite governor, joined in a bill with Senator John Stennis of Mississippi, in which the amendment said you cannot integrate the South unless you integrate the North. And he spoke about the racial hypocrisy of the North. In 1989, one of the granddaddies of the desegregation suits, still winding its way through the courts, is Sheff versus O'Neill in Hartford, Connecticut. And this, of course, is the famous Norman Rockwell illustration. That's Ruby Bridges integrating the New Orleans school system in 1960. This illustration was made in 1963. It's housed in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. As many of you know, President Obama visited this, and I don't have a picture of him, but he's visibly moved when he's looking at this illustration. If you draw concentric circles around Stockbridge, Massachusetts, every major urban center has segregated, de facto segregated housing and school systems. So we've moved from the moral clarity of the struggle versus legal segregation to the complexities of de facto segregation. And I want to leave you with this question. I mean, cotton is clearly out of the picture, but it was a force, an economic force. And today it upsets me that when we look at politics, the present day politics, we know that there are economic issues. You know, why don't we look in the past to find out what we can learn from those economic issues and the economic determinants of these massive movements in the economic structure of our society? And I want to leave you with a question. And that question is, why do those major cities in America today with large black populations and no history or minimal history of slavery, no history of legal segregation, and no history of sharecropping have the same racial issues as those cities and regions that did have them? Thank you. Sure.
right, we have some time for questions. If you would raise your hands, if you have any, we'll get the microphone to you. Does anybody
This
have
man
one?
over here.
Here we got one right over here. Yes, sir. She'll bring the mic.
My name is Ronaldo Williams from Harvard Initiative online newsletter. And my question is, do you think the Civil War was really a battle between the North and South control over cotton? Because it seems like they wanted to fight over this thing.
No, no. The question was a good question. Were they fighting over cotton? And the answer is no. What the cotton's role was to create an arrogance in the South that led to all sorts of grandiose schemes, which would be involved with taking over countries in Latin America, which would have been impossible because the British Navy would have blown them up, or something like that. It was the arrogance that was created by cotton that allowed the South to initiate. I find the parallels a bit difficult. I mean, in terms of the background, I mean, black people came to this country in shackles. The Hispanic people are coming from a labor surplus country to a place where they can get work. I mean, I don't see any analogy in terms of the history of what's going on, and in terms of parallels, very distinct at best. The immigrants today are voluntary. Black people were involuntary, and they. Yes.
I guess I was talking about the economic impact of the companies that are getting so rich off of the immigrant labor today, and the same economics talk that you talked about earlier.
No, the cotton was so much more dominant in our economic system than there's certainly, the immigrants have helped in many aspects of the American economy, but it's not as dominant as cotton was. I mean, the leading export in this country from 1803 to 1937, this was huge business.
Yes, sir.
I grew up on cotton. We farmed cotton a few years where I live, about 40 miles north of here. And I guess the question I have is, was cotton an easier crop than most crops? Because I realize one thing with it is how the need for moisture, and especially with the fact that the South gets more rain than many other parts of the country.
The question is cotton a more difficult crop than most other crops? And the answer is absolutely yes. And today, even when in the antebellum period, there was no choice in terms of cotton because people thought it was a cotton gold rush. And interestingly enough, it was a credit economy. It was a boom and bust cycle. There were only 3 periods that I can identify where people actually made money in the cotton world. And I think you were on the cusp in the 1861 of a cotton bubble. But there was no choice. Whereas today, if a farmer can grow cotton, soybeans, rice, or wheat, what they're going to look at is their profit margins. And so they're not going to, even when cotton spikes in terms of price, they're not going to automatically shift back to cotton because it's so expensive to farm. And the other question is, what would happen if subsidies were removed from the cotton world? And I don't think anything would happen because the farms would be bigger and more efficient, so production would not go down. We are a very efficient producer of cotton at this point.
Other questions? I've got one, Gene.
How much cotton exists in the South now? I'm in an urban area and I don't.
Oh, it's very low. It's Texas. Texas is the big. Yeah, California has been priced out of the market because of the spread of urban sprawl. Mississippi is 600,000 acres. It's tiny. Texas is a big producer at this point.
I want you to know that Nikolai found this book on a visit to Square Books in Oxford. And I was there a couple of days ago. By the way, I did pass several cotton fields between Batesville, Mississippi, and Oxford. It was still growing in some parts of Mississippi. You were recently at Square Books, not just to talk about this book, but to do a discussion on The Help. Would you, which is a national bestseller and now best-selling movie, would you give us your thoughts on The Help?
Who wants to stay another 40 minutes? What happened was, because I was from Mississippi and because I'd written this book on cotton and race in the making of America, people in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New York, and Ohio started calling me to ask me to make presentations, which I've done. And the presentation is called The Help, Fact, and Fiction. And what I do is show where it fits with other Southern novels. For example, there were 4 white Southern women who wrote novels that were astoundingly bestsellers and were made into movies in which actors and actresses were nominated for Academy Awards. She knew that. The first one, of course, this touched on the subject, Gone with the Wind. The second one is a very interesting one, which you probably haven't heard of. Yet another writer from Jackson, Mississippi, Sid Ricketts Sumner, called Quality. The movie, you should get it, is called Pinky. The third is To Kill a Mockingbird, wildly successful. And this book is very derivative of To Kill a Mockingbird. The author had 3 characters in The Help read To Kill a Mockingbird. And she used many examples from that. To Kill a Mockingbird, you want to guess how many books it sells a year? You'll be pleased, 1 million. When the British librarians, British, not American, were polled and they were asked, what book would you recommend an adult read before they die? Number 1, To Kill a Mockingbird. Number 2, the Bible. So she knew what she was doing in terms of this. The portrayal, is their caricatures, their extremes, which existed on both sides. There were personal relationships which many people in here can relate to. You really don't want me to go on another half hour. And I particularly dealt with the backdrop of this was the 1960s. And there were flashbacks to all sorts of events, whether Emmett Till, Medgar Evers, James Meredith, the issues, the faces we're very familiar with. And what I did was ask the question of what was going on in the North simultaneously. And even the 1963 particularly was chosen because it was still the year of hope. This was the I Have a Dream speech, August 28, 1963, which was just memorialized on in Washington, probably one of the most powerful American orations. And it ended with free at last, free at last. The spiritual, well, 2 years later in 1965, a black spokesman in Cleveland said the Negro is not free in the North. He is at the bottom of the economic ladder, often without a job, his children are in poor schools. And then does anybody know who that spokesman was? was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So within 2 years, after being blocked in Chicago, he had failed to move the civil rights movement north. What worked in Selma, what worked in Birmingham did not work in Chicago. So those are the kinds of things that I interject in terms of the help. The help could be a really positive piece of literature if it leads to discussions and further reading. If not, it will vanish.
All right. Any further questions? Yes, ma'am. We have a question right here. Wait for the mic, please.
You talked about lessons, that we should get lessons from what happened here. If you were going to choose one lesson that you can see in this and apply it to current times, what is that? What advice would you give the country now?
Well, the one in terms of economics would be to pay more attention to long-term economic trends, especially in the international world that we live in. And there's no better way to understand the mechanism of an international world than to look at the financing of cotton, the trade of cotton, et cetera. That Erlanger bond tells it all. And also, the lesson we should learn is that in our courses, we should not neglect economic and financial history. I'll get off my pulpit on that one. The other thing is essentially that in terms of race in America, we know that African Americans have excelled in every aspect of American life. We also know that there's an underclass which has been virtually intractable. And I think we need to get rid of our fairy tale versions of history, Reconstruction, et cetera, and look at what caused this and how to deal with it.
And now you have the opportunity to purchase and get signed Cotton and Race in the Making of America. Gene, thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks.